This presentation is about planning for a modern languages lesson, and it's just about the basics. I've got a real personal interest to this title. My perspective is that I'm school-based, I'm a teacher, and I've been involved in mentoring trainee teachers over the past, as well as examining or being an external examiner for a teacher training course. Charlie Burney of Bath Spa asked me what aspect I needed to work on most when I had trainees in school. My response was an awareness of the need for a sequence when planning a lesson. So here I am, this is what she asked me to talk about. As beginning teachers, you will be told quite rightly that there is no ideal way of teaching a language. There are loads of different theories and principles about teaching. But if you're told that, it can really be very daunting. It's a bit like having a blank sheet of paper in front of you and you're told to write a story. In my experience, when I was a beginning teacher and as a manager of beginning teachers, I really believe that it is helpful to, at the very least, have an account of an approach, even if it's not the approach, which I find underpins good practice. I think you need a starting point. It's then up to you to reject it, to adopt it, to adapt it, or create your own approach. This presentation crams principles and illustrations together. In any teaching context, obviously you adapt your style to suit the context, and in a way this is me just giving an excuse why this is a lecture style rather than getting you to stop and think about things. This is to make, I'm aware that we have people who are starting in September who need to have this all crammed in, so it is a lecture style, but then you can look back at it, and I really like to be able to discuss things. So here I'm modelling, rather than what I would do with a normal class, it's what I do with a really keen class, keen to get on very, very quickly, but knowing that they can get back and talk to me at any time they want. So I do love the job, enjoy sharing, but do get in touch with us if there's anything you want us to talk about. Right, I'd like to start with acknowledgements. A lot of this has been drawn from my own notes, which I took in 1981 when I was in Goldsmiths and had fantastic tutors of Mr. Banks and Mr. Swain. Throughout my career, which has been going for 40 years now, I've had loads of professional development opportunities, whether by the local education authority or the district where I've been in, but in particular through the Association for Language Learning, and that's where I met Charlie Burney from Bath Spa. There are loads of books that I could recommend. I've been found particularly helpful and comprehensive this book, Learning to Teach Foreign Languages in the Secondary School, and I've had the privilege of meeting people who have been behind that, including Norbert Pachler, who is a fellow of ALL, and there's just an example of the Language Learning Journal, which you would have access to if you're a member of ALL. So here's my introduction. The importance of planning. For any subject, planning is important. You have to take into account constraints of the defined curriculum, the timetable, the assessments, and particularly the accountability system. This is something which makes the UK stand out, I think, from quite a lot of other countries, in that we have a very publicly accountability system. You obviously want to make the most efficient and effective use of time. Acknowledge that acquiring a second language in a secondary school context in the UK is not the same as acquiring your first language. So this is a crash course in the essentials you need to know, I think, about sequencing a lesson. I'd like to stress that eventually it does become second nature. It trips off the tongue. Sometimes you really don't need to write it down. It's so much ingrained in you how you want to prepare a lesson. But it really is worth investing a long time in grasping the essentials before you start elaborating your lessons, and that's what this is about. Typically, school departments take a collaborative approach to overall planning. So, for example, you'd have a department which gives an overview for the year, mid-term planning, short-term planning. They use something called a scheme of work. Often we use that as an acronym, scheme of work, and it often draws heavily on coursebook teacher notes. And you've got a picture here of a coursebook that I enjoy using, Studio, but there'll be teacher notes that go with it. But it is essential for you to have a professional understanding of the principles guiding that planning. That way you can critique it. You can identify what might need to be changed or tweaked in order to suit an individual class, and that will happen. You have a class with, even if it's a setted situation, you've got people with different abilities, different needs. You're going to have to look at it. You will probably have to adapt it in some way. And the other thing is, and this is a word that's really important, anticipate misconceptions which could interfere with progress. And this is something where, as someone who's already skilled in whatever we're teaching, it sometimes can be difficult to stand back and think, yes, but what is the thing which the people in front of me might find difficult? So although you will have this support, you'll want to do something yourself to make it your own for that particular class. So here's just an example of the sort of very, very broad brush overview that a school might give you, so that you've worked out, yes, here's our course, we've worked out the timings, we know that we will be able to get through this if we keep pretty much with these. Most schools, certainly my school, is not rigid about this, but it's giving you, somebody else has done the spade work to see how it would fit in. And then if you look at the textbook, I would say definitely, if you've got a textbook, look at what the teacher notes have got. I think it's an underused resource. I think often because you have to click on something and download it, it's not always provided as a hard copy. I think it's something which can be neglected, and it's really good that people have done the work for you. So here, for example, here's an overview of a particular unit to tell you how it's going through. It means that it will have done the thinking for you as well as to where things are revisited. This is a particular thing at the moment, but it's something that people talk about is retrieval and making sure that we go back to things. It's something we've always been doing. Course books do bring in things again and again, deliberately so. If you look at their planning, you can see that happening. And if it doesn't, then make sure that you insert activities which make sure that that happens. So they will give an overview of your unit, but also, for example, here's a lesson, and it's very specific. You've got what the background is, the grammar, what's the key language, what are the resources, extra resources, and it takes you through a sequence which you could use. Also, it gives you the tape script, the audio script, which is essential, really, really essential to use that, a very, very neglected, underused part of the course often. And you can copy and paste that into, for example, text manipulation programs like Text-of-8 or Task Magic or Quizlet or lots of others, where you can make up your own games. So that's all done for you. I've just put in this slide because it may be that you're interested in looking at videos of lessons which have been designed just using that. So during lockdown period, I put together quite a lot of lessons, which at least could be a starting point for people. And for beginning teachers, maybe you'd like to just see some of those, just to see how they pan out. Here's an overview of this presentation. I'm first of all going to talk about the aims and invite you to think about what you think are the broad aims for language teaching, giving you some examples. I'm then going to look at how you can formulate objectives for your teaching in terms of language, and also think about what the implications would be for your teaching. I'll talk about short-term objectives and lesson planning. This is the main thing I'm going to stress on: methods for language teaching. How would you put together a sequence? And spoiler alert, this is how I would put together a sequence. First of all, selecting your vocabulary or your grammar and selecting something so that it makes a pattern which people can then recognise. Then deliberately going through 4 phases of introducing that pattern. And this example is for listening and speaking. And then how you could put those same 4 phases towards reading and writing. I'll talk about grammar, setting the scene in the lesson. So what about the broad aims for language teaching? I'm just going to look at 2 ends of the spectrum, I think. For people who have an approach towards language which is basically on people needing to know the grammar, and being able to learn a language through translating from that language into their own language or from their own language into the target language, the term tends to be used grammar and translation. And often the aims behind that approach are cognitive, cultural and linguistic. Cognitive in particular, in that it's an intellectual discipline. You're training people to be able to be accurate. There can still be a cultural side of it, but look at it as particularly, being more interested and less prejudiced, but also having an effect on the person themselves, that they become a cultured individual. I like that expression. Instinctively to prefer the good to the shoddy. And then there's obviously the language, realising the way words express thought, getting greater clarity and precision in the use of the mother tongue. So those are all worthy aims. Notice, though, in particular here, there isn't a reference to a practical value, and speaking isn't particularly referenced. Now, this grammar translation method was the way that people were taught largely in grammar schools, in schools where languages were taught. In the olden days, in the before comprehensive schools, it was mainly in the grammar schools that you would learn languages, not in the secondary modern schools. And when schools went to be comprehensive and everyone was doing a language, I think that's where there was a struggle, where people were having to think of methods that were going to be appropriate for everybody, for the whole ability range. Unfortunately, by 1977, it looks as if there still were problems here. This is what the HMI, Her Majesty's Inspectorate, came up with. In all but a few schools, underperformance in all 4 language skills by abler pupils. The setting of impossible or pointless tests for average, and in particular less able pupils. And the abandonment of modern language learning at the first opportunity, so people not carrying on with it. An inability to produce other than inadequate or largely unusable statements in the foreign language. Inefficient reading skills and writing, limited mainly to mechanical reproduction, presumably this grammar translation idea, which was often inaccurate. So not a brilliant picture back in 1977. And another method which people would talk about is the communicative method, as opposed to grammar and translation method. Now, this had been talked about. These are quotations from the 60s, but I don't think necessarily they'd all been put into action. A communicative aim for teaching is stressing the linguistic and the cultural, rather than the cognitive. So the primacy of communication, to enable people of different languages to speak to each other, to equip people to cross the language barrier, and cultural, one more window on the world, a chance to extend their experience through contact with different people and culture, so differently expressed, but that idea about the intellectual discipline was less pronounced. Now, this is something which then became particularly used during the 80s, particularly the late 80s, and into the 90s, and there are still people who will use communicative approach rather than grammar and translation. Not everyone, though, liked this approach. Some people experienced it as something which, yes, communication was most important, linguistic and cultural, but there were some people who felt that they still were not really understanding. They needed to have that understanding of why things worked. And someone who I know was not happy with that approach was somebody who currently is in education, an important minister, Nick Gibb. And my feeling is it's probably that's a big reason, a big drive as to why he has been very interested, because he is someone who wants people to be doing languages, and he is looking at other ways and encouraging people to look at other ways, thinking back to his own experience of not perhaps enjoying this, and I do know that. And so more and more now people are looking back at, well, perhaps we ought to be looking more at grammar and translation. You can pause now, perhaps think about what do you think about it, and as you experience teaching and learning, you'll come up with your own ideas. For what it's worth, I feel that there are things that you can take from all of these areas. I don't think it has to be one or the other. So you've got here, obviously, the idea to be able to communicate is important. Who can say that's not important? Who can say that speaking to each other is not important? Obviously, cultural is important. It's something which really motivates people to find out about how other people work. how they are. And actually, yes, not just to be able to know about others, but also here it says extend their experience, but here why not? This idea of bringing more culture to the individual, making them reflect on themselves. And this cognitive idea, I have to say, as somebody who has taught, and I reckon that communicative language teaching is a way that I would teach, I have never ever ignored it as an intellectual discipline. For me, it's just been the order in which I've done things. And we're going to come along with that later, but yeah, nothing wrong with it being an intellectual discipline as well. When you're planning a lesson, you will need to have very clear in your mind what your linguistic objectives are. And how can you formulate your linguistic objectives in terms of skills, structures and situations? And what are the implications then for your teaching, the practice, the relevance, the understanding? Here we are. Linguistic objectives often are expressed in terms of the skills which the pupils will be able to acquire, the structures they use. You might think of that as grammar, but structures can be a very helpful way of talking about it, and in what situations are they going to use it. So this is you're starting off, if you like, from a communicative language teaching point of view, is communication is the most important thing. So how are we going to look at this? What are the skills? Well, here's an example. You could have overview of a course book. Once they've completed it, they should understand the language as spoken by native speakers, express their needs and feelings, their likes and dislikes, be able to function competently in everyday situations, read and understand everyday written matter, and write a simple letter in the language. So the skills are listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Before I go on, can I just say I've just made this up. It doesn't actually say that for Studio High. I went with another course book. But anyway, this is something where as you get into the teaching world, again, these are going to trip off the tongue: listening, speaking, reading, writing. And that's often the order in which we say them, because that is the order in which you acquire language, isn't it? You hear it first, then you say it, you imitate it, then you're introduced to what it looks like in writing, so you do the reading bit before you go on to the writing. And right up to very, very recently, that tends to be the way in which the skills are defined for the GCSE examination. There are suggestions at the moment for change, but that really is how we've been talking about listening, speaking, reading and writing. What about the structures? Well, that's just where, and here, yes, just be aware of the fact that you'll talk about the receptive skills of listening and reading. You're receiving them. Doesn't mean that they're any easier, but just be aware that they're called receptive, and the productive ones are the speaking and the writing, where you actually produce something. Structures, well, that's where perhaps instead of writing the grammatical description, get used to expressing it in terms of the structure that's being used. So there isn't a something, or it is the plus a noun, or to ask something to somebody. Making them manageable units, so structures rather than conventional grammatical units or categories. And it's this idea of manageable units. You're thinking about what it is they're going to be able to do at the end. And then be aware of the situation. So, for example, how to ask the time, how to make arrangements to meet someone, how to discuss and describe clothes. It's useful to have in your mind when you're teaching this structure for this skill, in what context would they need it. So defining the situations, that often determines the vocabulary that you're going to need, and preferably think about real life, or at least relevant situations. So when planning your lessons, you need to have very clearly in your mind what the short-term objectives are for that plan. I'm now going to show you a very simple thought process for defining learning objectives, and it's pretty much word for word the way I was trained in Goldsmiths in 1981, but it's helped me. So let's go. This thought process for defining objectives. I've got 3 examples, and here's example number 1, where it's to do with directions, and you'd imagine that this was a task set within the requirements of your scheme of work. They have to recognise and act on oral directions, specifically à gauche, à droite, tout droit, to the left, to the right, and straight on. So here are the 3 steps which you can go through, which will help to plan your lesson. Number 1, what specific bits of language, so in terms of structures and vocabulary, do I want this class to handle? And in what way, as far as the skills? So you've got the skills, the structures and the vocabulary. And is that going to be receptive? Is it going to be active? Is it going to be speaking orally? Is it going to be in writing? And what situation could you use? So that's going back to those 3 ideas of the skills, the structures and the situation. So what sort of answer could you have? Well, for structures, probably because it's recognising they've got to understand go, perhaps in either the formal way aller or the informal way va, and then obviously these particular phrases. So it's quite straightforward, but you're thinking about, it's not enough just to know those, you've got to know like go, straight on, turn, whatever. The skills, it's to recognise and act on. So in fact, the only skill you need for this particular task is the listening. It's the receptive one. And I think that's important when you're planning to build that in. There's a first step, well, that you can understand people telling you what to do. And the situation, well, I think most people would, it's often in the street. It could be that somebody has another situation of telling people what to do in a building, a big building, how to get around to school. You can think of your own situation for that. Worthwhile thinking, is it going to provide evidence of learning, of an extension of skill, and if so, in what form? Well, it will be particularly going to the listening, the ability to follow directions, able to say where they end up on a plan or reach a destination or trace a route. So, and this is what I would always put at the start of any sequence of learning, what will the pupil be able to do at the end of it as a result of it? So what will pupils know, understand and do? How can that be expressed in something you can observe? Here's an idea. By the end of the lesson, pupils will be able to, and by the way, I would always start with that. As a head of department, I used to have a pro forma for people to use for a lesson plan, and it would be pre-populated with various words, and one would be in the very first column of your plan at the top. Pupils will be able to, and then they would write in know, understand, say, read. It forces you then to express your objective in a way that can be observed. Okay, here, and this was particularly good advice from Anselm, try and make it realistic, whatever it is, and it really helps to put it into words. To write it down does help. Here's another example, this time with adjectives. Here's a second example, the thought process for defining an objective to do with adjectives. So imagine then that within your short term, your planning, you're asked to use the oral and written form of 4 adjectives of nationality, singular forms only, viz. Anglais, anglaise, français, française, allemand, allemande, italien, italienne. And by the way, when I gave this talk, I was asked what the word vis meant, and so I did look up where it all came from. So shortened for this Latin, vide, however you would pronounce that according to how you've been trained. I did do A-level Latin, different ways of doing it. Licet, which itself is a contraction of the Latin phrase videre licet, meaning it is permitted to see. And hard see, we don't know, do we? Somebody will know and perhaps tell me. It is used as a synonym for mainly, to wit, which is, or as follows. So I'll probably say as follows. So first of all, what situation could it be used in? I realised actually with the other example I didn't put the situation first. I think it's quite helpful perhaps to have that as a situation. What specific bits of language do I need, and in what way? What skills? Is it receptive, active, orally, or in writing? So there, a possible example answer could be, the situation could be discussing celebrities. He is English, she is French. The structure, he is English, French, etc. And particularly, and I remember, by the way, that this was a task I remember being set as my very first task I was given in 1981 as a beginning teacher. And I remember particularly picking out from this that this point, I reckon that the aim was showing the difference between the masculine and the feminine format, using deliberately adjectives, aren't they, where you'd hear the difference. Anglais, anglaise, français, française, allemand, allemande, italien, italienne. So probably in your sequence of learning, you'd have done adjectives before where there wasn't a difference, and then you'd be bringing in this difference to show it depends on whether it's masculine or feminine. However, it would be an additional complication to put in the position of the adjective. So it is a green pullover, it is un pullover vert, the other way around. Anyway, that's just an example of what you would say. And the listening here, because it says it's oral and written forms, then you're aware that you need, if you want the oral form, you've got to have the listening and the speaking. If it's written, you need both reading and writing. And whenever I put in speaking, I always implicitly mean it includes pronunciation and phonics. So don't make a distinction of that, but some people might. So what about the extension of skill or the learning? What would it be? Well, here I've already thought about the fact that I'm assuming they would already know that third person of Paul and he is. I'd probably be thinking, I would imagine I've already taught known adjectives where the pattern is not heard, but here I'm going to be comparing it. And there'd be vocabulary that I would think about it and from the outset that I'd want to include in this activity. If it's to do with discussing celebrities, I'd want them to know voici, here is, je vous présente, I introduce to you, décrit, describe. And the question, il est de quelle nationalité? What nationality is he? Thinking about it, probably I should have put that bit into the structures that I would expect them to know or use. So given all of this, how can I express that as pupils will be able to, by the end of the lesson, pupils will be able to ask and answer questions about an individual's nationality in speech and in writing. And now let's go on to the third example. And this is the one that I'm going to be using as an example for the sequence, which I'll show you. So here, imagine you have the task to use oral and written forms of the structure a, to, and the definite articles, the, in the singular only. So I've just realised I've put singular forms only and I've included plural, but never mind. Au, to the, à la, to the, à la, to the, or is to the. All of those mean to the, but we know that it's all for the masculine, à la if it's feminine, that's if it's a vowel or an H, and that's if it's plural. So imagine that I haven't got the singular forms only. What situation could you use? What specific bits of language? Receptive, active, orally, what is it? So the possible answer could be, and again you could pause and think it for yourself if you are a beginning teacher and using it for this purpose. Here comes the answer for me anyway. The situation could be places in a town. Okay, of course it could have been something else, couldn't it? It could have been within a shopping centre, but here I'm just saying in a town. All skills, because it's oral, you've got to have the listening and the speaking. Because it's written, you've got to have reading and writing. And here are the structures that I'm particularly saying could be useful for this. I'm deliberately saying I'd start with the third person. I'd have the verb aller, to go. So il, elle, on va, or the name va. And then those structures which have been mentioned. What will it provide evidence of? Well, I've deliberately said that I would have to retrieve the distinction or the concept of gender. So I'd start with an activity making sure they knew the un, le, a, the, une, la, des, les. And I'd make sure that they know they remembered their pronouns for he or she, and the verb aller in the third person. They'd also need to know places in the town. So to be able to think of, this is my aim, this is what I'm going to be using as my structures, but I would expect them to know these things beforehand. And that's going to affect my plan, in that I'll have some sort of warm activity, up activity to make sure they've got it. So in the end, how would this task, how would that, as originally a grammatical category, you're going to teach this, how can I express it in a learning objective, as a pupil behavioural objective? By the end of the lesson, pupils will be able to Ask and answer questions about where someone is going in a town. So the learning is the nationality and the retrieval is the third person singular. And I just thought I perhaps haven't put in there a questioning format, I suppose because it is possible to ask the question as a statement and make your intonation go up at the end, which is how I definitely would do this to begin with. If you're preparing another language, it may be that that's something which is not a possibility. Once you've decided what your linguistic objective is, you've got to think about how you're going to put that across, how you're going to lead the lesson to a stage where the pupils are able to do, know, understand, whatever it is you've had as your object. In these few slides, I'm going to talk about the role of speech in learning and how this can really make a big difference to how people learn. So the principle, the overriding principle, particularly of communicative language teaching, is that you take every opportunity possible to get pupils speaking. Try to make speech acts the integral part of learning. So whether it is you're learning vocabulary, structures or grammar, try and make every opportunity you can so that people are talking. And it's probably worthwhile, before we just look at that, to consider what speech is. And recognising those distinctions, that you have language, a system and pool of linguistic resources, and then speech is the activity. Think about the difference between oral, spoken speech and written speech. Also between conversational speech and non-conversational speech. Some of the characteristics of the speech act. One is that there's an interactivity, listener and speaker duo, a social activity involving perception and production of speech. It's actively situated in a place and a time. There's a situational context. There's a communicative intent. There's that motivation to speak because you're wanting to get across a message or an instruction or a question. You've got something to communicate. There has to be some sort of content. You can't teach it in a void. There has to be a message. Recognise that immediacy of recognition of sound patterns and the comprehension of message. It's something which is very different from writing, where you can pick up your pen, take time and think, and then write things out. There is an immediacy in the speech act. There's often an element of spontaneity. There is varying degrees of fluency. Utterances are not always fully fledged sentences, even though a sentence is a unit of speech. Something which is part of speech, hesitations, repetitions, for some reason I put accents there, incomplete utterances, non-linguistic noises like laughter, those are all parts of a speech act. And then you have actual no noise at all, which accompanies the speech, nods, shakes of head, gestures, facial expressions. But the most important thing and characteristic of a speech act is that the listener and the speaker is thinking about the content, not the form of the utterance. If they had to spend time thinking through the grammar, a structure, before it came out of their mouths, it would take quite a long time. The focus is on content rather than form. And that's where a communicative method, I think, is very effective, in that it's talking about the primacy of speech, the primacy of content. So, implications of the nature of speaking for the classroom and for learning. You want to make classroom speech as authentic as possible, but recognise the limitations. It is artificial. You're in a classroom, you're not outside in the world, so you might be teaching directions and how to get to places, but you're within the confines of a classroom. So you've got that physical situation. The social situation is different. You've got a teacher and 30 children. That's very different from an authentic situation. The motivation to speak. We know that when children are in the classroom, you're having to really invent reasons as to why they should feel motivated to speak. It's not necessarily natural. And then be aware of linguistic performances, especially in the early stages, can be a source of stress for learners. So what do we have as a solution? Well, dip into linguistics, the psychology of learning, methodology, in order to find ways where you can address this artificiality. And I can assure you, you can do. You can get very lively classes where people are learning and they are able to suspend that disbelief. This is taken from criticisms in 1982, but there are the same sort of criticisms that sometimes level towards using speaking in classes, even in our day now. I'm talking 2021. So there was a time when people would say it was really practically non-existent. I don't think you're going to find classes now when that's the case, but it's still perhaps something where we do need to get even more speaking into our classrooms. There has been criticism sometimes that there isn't a systematic and sustained practice in speaking of new language patterns taught. So a new language pattern can sometimes be presented just through reading and writing, and not through listening and speaking. There's also sometimes a criticism of the fact that the texts used are unsuitable for oral exploitation. They're perhaps texts which were written for reading, not for speaking aloud. There are some who are criticised that they're just emphasising mechanical transformations and substitutions, rather than talking about the grammar itself. And also sometimes there can be criticisms of just wholesale repetition and memorisation, with the idea of it being conditioning. Context is important in presenting new material, and there's a danger sometimes context is not considered. So let's look at, first of all, what might a grammar translation approach be to, and this is particularly looking at those points of 1, 2, 3. To what extent are you speaking? Are you using speaking to do the language pattern? And, to what extent is the text suitable for speaking? Grammar translation approach, what might happen? The teacher would select the grammatical category, for example, a, to, plus a noun, to the baker, to the whatever, to the bakery, to the school. Then they would write a cryptic equation on the board. A plus le, to plus the masculine is o. A plus la, a la. A plus L apostrophe, a L apostrophe. A plus les equals o. So they might do that. Or, more imaginatively, they might put it in sentences. He goes to the wall, he goes to the bank, he goes to the church, he goes to the shops. So what's happened there? They've written this out onto the board, and then you make pupils aware of the relationship between a and masculine, feminine, plural nouns. You give the rules. This is a process of analysis, and then more examples can be given. So in this sense, this method, the presentation of new grammar is deductive. From the general rule, we give you the general rule, and then you deduce from that specific instances. Pupils can then translate, concoct examples, do gap-filling exercises, and answer random questions. And when they can do all this, the teacher moves on to the next grammar point. So the next slide is going to talk about a criticism of that approach. Firstly, that theoretical knowledge, that's grammar, is seen of paramount importance, more so than, for example, communication, applying the language. When you come to discuss grammatical relations, it's an abstract concept. That is a difficult operation for many, and that's something we need to be aware of because it's abstract, it's not concrete. And certainly when you're thinking about the full ability range, which post the grammar secondary modern divide you are, because it's mixed ability, everybody is being taught languages, you do have to take that into account. Throughout what we've just seen, there's an emphasis on form, the formal properties of language. So pupils are form conscious, not thinking about the meaning, content conscious. If I were to say to you now, so what were the examples given, which had the nouns in the previous slide, you wouldn't necessarily have remembered what they were. If you remember, what were they? It was he goes to the wall, the bank, the church, the shops. Possibly bank, church, shops you might have got, but in fact wall, why would you say he goes to the wall? So this is in contrast to the fact that in speech, normally we are content conscious. We're thinking about the semantic properties, the message. If we don't do that, pupils literally have no time to communicate the thought because they are preoccupied with this construction of the language. So there's no communicative intent, there's no motivation. It's just, I suppose, people might be motivated if they just want to prove that they can deduce from the example how to do things. There can be an internal, an intrinsic sense of motivation for that, I suppose, but it's not everybody who will get that. Let's be honest. No, nothing to say, no spontaneity of expression, and the presentation has no context. It didn't say, right, we're going to teach you how to go to places in a town. The model sentences are just floating in a void. So there's no chance to mirror the speech act in any sense, because no opportunity is given to perceive and produce the speech in a realistic setting. There's no social activity there. But even if you are going to say, well, that is the approach I want to use, the criticism here is that in that particular case, the presentation of formal properties of language it's weak and ineffectual. No account has been taken of the fact that in those instances, or alla, etc., although conceptually similar, they all mean to the, so the concept is similar, they're all the same grammatical category, but look at them, they're formally dissimilar, or alla, they all look different. And that could cause difficulties, especially in the early stages of modern foreign language learning. So let's go on to another, and very definitely not the approach, another approach. And I'm going to talk about communicative language teaching, this emphasis on communication. So the aim for this form of teaching is to present the foreign language speech in a manner that makes it immediately functional. You can immediately apply it to a situation. The point, though, to be aware of is that grammar is still there. It's justified. Of course we need grammar. No speech is impossible without it. But equally, no speech is possible without lexis, the content, either. You cannot teach language just in a void. It has to have a context. It has to have language, words. So oral speech, think about it, it consists of organised noises that convey a message. It's got form, it's got content. The content is the meaning, which is mainly to be found in the vocabulary, and the form is the phonological structure and the grammatical structure. So in speaking, we concentrate on content, and we must be able to handle that form almost automatically. We just haven't got time. We're thinking on our feet. So in language teaching, we should, in introducing oral speech, present and practice new grammatical structures in such a way that pupils are engaged in these little mini speech acts so that they can gain automatic control over the form of their utterances while their attention is focused upon the content. They're thinking about what they want to say, but they shouldn't have to be thinking too much about the form. So the section that I'm looking at now is concerned with the ways and means of teaching the formal aspect of language as integral to the teaching of oral speech. So you aren't teaching this in a vacuum, you're also using speech. You're using it as a reason to do lots and lots of speaking. Really importantly though, as I keep saying, this approach does not mean that we don't talk about or explain grammar. It's recommending presenting and practicing through a speech act first, rather than having grammar as the starting point. So concentrating on content first, form second. But I cannot stress enough, it is not saying we do not do grammar. Here's an example of how you might prepare a lesson or an episode within a lesson where the focus is on teaching a structure. First of all, you have to identify a pattern. Find a structure that or select the structure that you're teaching. So for example, in French, to, and then whatever the noun is, to the bakers, to the bank, to the beach, to the places in the town, for example. So that's the structure you want to teach. Select a sentence that exhibits a pattern within the structure. So we know that in French, for example, there's a different way of saying to the, according to whether it's masculine, feminine, begins with a vowel or is plural, but let's just choose one pattern where there is something which is constant. Il va à la poste. There we are, the structure is à la poste and it's constant. Then choose several examples of that structure, keeping the structural element constant, so the à la, all the same, but vary the word, à la poste, à la maison, à la gare, and then we get a language pattern, and there it is. I recommend that when you put that pattern together, and you want to put it in a sentence, if you can make it in the third person, not contrasting I and you, then it's much easier to do question answer work on third person. They don't have to, you don't have to say, where are you going, I'm going. It's just much easier. And in French, consider about how to make that pattern stand out without any additional complication of pronunciation or liaison. So in this example, for example, I know that with je vais, I go, it ends with an S. You can say je vais à la banque or je vais à la banque. If there's anything where you'd have to have done that liaison in whatever structure you're doing, I'd avoid it for the example, because there's a danger that they might think it's je vais à ça. They might think the word ça means to the. So anticipate these misconceptions, be prepared to be explicit if necessary, and ensure that all these words have been learnt before. The pattern is thereby obtained by utilising the relations that you've got in any sentence or phrase. So the existing unit, to the, in this sense, to the, and the potential units, which are the words. So that's the paradigm. And initially try to make it formally similar, so it's really, really obvious what the pattern is. And you can get immediate practice on that when you've got that. There's visual as well as auditory similarity, as perceptual similarity. People will be able to notice it. So similarity is one of the conditions for learning. But also contrast can help the learning. I mean, just as here, I suppose that's the similar bit. This is the contrast. When you take it a bit step further, we've got contrast here in the ways to say to the, according to whether it's feminine, masculine, begins with a vowel or an H, or is plural. So this particular one exhibits both similar and contrasting features. The aim is that these grammatical and phonological skills of the Speech Act come under automatic control. You're not having to think about it, it's a habit, so the learner can be focused on whether they're wanting to say he goes to the person goes to the shops, rather than, oh, how do I say to the? That's really the development of the speaking skill. And here are some examples of the layout of other languages that you might have. So that's selecting a pattern first of all. Normally, when you're using a very well-designed course book, by the way, a lot of this will have been thought out for you, but sometimes it hasn't, and sometimes when you get to the later stages of learning, with perhaps a less able year 10, year 11, it may be that you are going to have to yourself make up this first stage before they go into whatever the book has planned. There might be a few too many assumptions in a book. Right, practicing the pattern, 4 phases. They are demonstration, comprehension, reproduction, and production. This was how I was trained at first, and I'm just going to give you spoiler alert now. I'm going to show you these as well. But this is what it means. First of all, the teacher somehow makes a way of demonstrating the language and tries to make it so that it's in a context that the students have got a chance of being able to understand what you mean. You've got pictures, you've got actions, gesture, you've got perhaps a video clip, something which makes the context clear so they might be able to work out what it's all about. But certainly the more you're saying it, the more they're hopefully perceiving, noticing a pattern. The next stage, are they understanding what you're saying? Yeah, I mean, for some people, you just do this in English. That really makes it much shorter. I suppose people might think, but why not use the language, the spoken language, to elicit that, to find out if they've understood. Make it a natural way of, this is your way of showing me you've understood. Say, you know, well, I'm going to show you the ways that you can do that. Then you get to a really fun stage normally, reproduction, different ways of saying things again and again and again. So stages 1 and 2, they've heard you speak. They don't say anything. They're really hearing it and trying to hear it as much as possible from you before you get any student to repeat. Because when a student repeats, they might get it a little bit wrong. That might be the thing that other students hear. So really invest a lot in the stages 1 and 2 before you get onto repetition. And then finally the productive stage, and that's where they'll show that they can take that structure and put it into another context. So that's your summary, which I'm about to demonstrate now. Just to say that I found that a lot of people now talk in terms of these 3 stages: presentation, practice, production. I would make a plea to people not to forget this comprehension stage. That's sometimes a real problem. If you haven't really checked that they understand what you're saying, sometimes they can appear to understand because they're saying things correctly, they seem to be applying it, but you might find at the end of the lesson, after all that, there was a little thing that they hadn't understood. Other phrases I've heard for stages then, I've liked this one: meet, manipulate, make your own. It sounds good, doesn't it? But I'd say probably the meet is all of these together, seeing it, understanding it, doing a bit of practice with it before finally you can manipulate it into your own area, make it your own. So there we've got the example of our pattern. He goes to the place. How could we demonstrate it? Teacher gives several examples. Pupils listen, perceive, recognise, notice the pattern, but they don't speak yet. So these are the phrases that the teacher might say, but they don't see. Jean va à la mairie, Marie va à la plage. Obviously, you need to have some sort of picture, visual, so that they can see what that is. The ideal is to think ahead as to how you're going to use this for some sort of genuine communicative context. And games are the easiest things to do for that. Or you can make it fun, surprising, memorable, personal, something which catches their attention. I recommend that when you first do the demonstration, you don't show the text, but just do it in speech. The rationale for that is that the context is perhaps more authentic, because you wouldn't normally be introduced to this language with the words there as well. And this is the most important thing. You're embedding correct pronunciation before you introduce some possible native language interference. If they see it written down, they might have a very good memory for that spelling, and their automatic understanding of English phonetics might kick in and get in the way. So here's an example. Imagine I'm the teacher and I will say, right, these students are in Cabourg with the school, that's where we go in year 8, they're playing. They're going to look for instructions for finding a treasure which is hidden. So treasure hunt really. And you would tell them, Jean va à la mairie. Jean va à la mairie. Ça c'est la mairie. Il y a une mairie à Cabourg. Ça c'est la mairie. Et Jean va à la mairie. Anne. Anne va où? Anne va où? Alors Anne va à la gare. À la gare, ça c'est la gare. À Cabourg, il y a une gare. Voilà la gare. Anne va à la gare. So in Cabourg, there is a station. There is the station. Anne goes to the station. Ensuite, nous avons Marie. Marie. Elle va à la mairie? Non. Elle va à la gare? Non. Marie va à la plage. Marie va à la plage. Jean va à la mairie. Anne va à la gare. Marie va à la plage. À la plage. Et Paul, il va où? Il va où? Paul va où? Paul va à la poste. Ça c'est la poste. It's the post office. It's a post office sign. À la poste. Anne va à la gare. Ça c'est la gare. Anne va à la gare. Jean à la mairie, Marie à la plage, et Paul va à la poste. So you find loads and loads of ways of just saying it again, as much as you can, as long as you keep their attention. But then you're going to, having done that demonstration, oh, and by the way, yeah, if you were doing it distance learning and you can't do it live, Jean va à la mairie. Anne va à la gare. Marie va à la plage. Paul va à la poste. And you'd encourage them to play it again and again and again. I would say probably the best way though is always the live face-to-face, or indeed if you're recording your lessons, just record yourself doing what I've just done just now. So what do you think about showing the text? I'd already mentioned that, pros and cons. What do you think of the pros? Perhaps helps them to see the pattern as well as hear the pattern. And for some people, it really is necessary to see those words to remember it. So, bring it in at an early stage. But the anti part of it is, if you see the word, it could blur the pattern or interfere with the pronunciation. So overall, I'd say, yeah, definitely make them see the word eventually, and certainly within the lesson before they go home. But leave it until you've done quite a lot of practice with the oral. Right, while we're looking at pronunciation, this is really important to deliberately draw attention to the sound spelling correspondence, SSC. Explicitly train them in associating how something is spelt with how it sounds. So, for example, Jean va à la mairie. Anne va à la banque. Marie va à la plage. La plage. Paul va à la poste. Poste, pas post. Poste, ost, post, ost, post. And then for later stages, you've got this. Now, I'm talking about later stages because probably I wouldn't necessarily bring in the English at this stage, but you decide. You can decide what you think is really necessary and when to do it. By the way, I normally use green to say, be very, very aware about how to pronounce that. Anne va à l'église, so that could be your symbol always for when it's a liaison, à l'église. Paul va à la poste. So each click is bringing it on. Probably we should have put a red bit there, au magasin, saying don't pronounce the X. And then you've got a static version which you can use for your various testing of it. So you could say for the next one, this is where I'm coming up to the comprehension. This is the demonstration then done. Demonstration done. Comprehension. I've put there repeat, 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 and it's you repeating, not the student at this stage. You keep repeating it so they keep hearing it. Jean va à la poste. I probably actually wouldn't put in the esque. Jean va à la poste? Oui ou non? Paul va à la gare? Oui ou non? Qui va à la poste? Who goes there? What are the names? Or Jean va à la mairie, vrai ou faux? So it's good to make sure that when you're teaching, you get these patterns so that they just automatically know to say oui, non, to say the name, or true or false. So closed questions at this stage, you don't want them to have to repeat the structure. To say the structure, you're deliberately making them keeping on hearing it said perfectly before they have to say it. But what sort of activity are you going to use? Well, you could just show them it and ask them the question and say, Jean va à la mairie? And they go, oui. But why are you asking that? You're the teacher. You can see he's going to the town hall. Why do that? So make it into a little game. And now I'll say, Paul va à la gare. Paul is going to the station. And then it can be a genuine yes or no. Are you guessing? Oui. Non. Paul va à la poste. Marie va à la poste. Marie va à la poste. Oui ou non? Oh, non. Marie va à la plage. So have that sort of hide reveal. It's really helpful. You can turn it into a game. I like the game Secret Choice, where perhaps I would have given the students cards with, say, 8 different places, and they choose a place. They show the rest of the class, but not me, and I tell them I can mind read, and I can tell which one they have chosen, and they will score a point for every wrong choice I make. And you could do that, say, 3 times. Thank that mark and then say, right, you need to learn how to say these things so that you can challenge me now. So that's the comprehension stage. Then we get to reproduction. That's saying the phrase, normally by the teacher offering alternative questions. So, Jean, il va à la plage, ou il va à la poste? And they can answer à la poste. And then finally, a goal question. Jean, il va où? Jean, he's going where? Il va à la poste. So that it's within a very, very familiar, well-practiced, well-rehearsed context, which is why we're calling it just the reproduction of the pattern. So closed questions there, and then an open question here, but it's an open question within a context that they know. Some people might call this the productive stage. So again, you've got a static version which you can use for those games. So now I could say Paul va à la poste ou Paul va à la gare. Get them to answer, and Paul va à la poste. So that's the repetition stage, and that's where this secret choice game comes in, and that you can then, I've got the cards, you as the teacher have the 8 cards, you select one which you put in a very obvious place so they know you're not cheating. They've got to mind read, they've got to know what that card is, and they will say to you, il va à la plage, non, il va à la poste, non, il va à la mairie, oui. So there, I would have scored 2 points because they got it wrong twice. Before you go on to the productive stage in this particular instance, you're also going to have to practice the other subcategories, the sub-patterns of the phrase to the. So I would suggest you could contrast, first of all, the feminine with, they're all masculine. So, à Cabourg, il y a une piscine, voilà la piscine. Jean va à la piscine. Mais Anne, à Cabourg, il y a un stade, voilà le stade. Anne va au stade. Paul va au cinéma. Marie va au terrain de golf. Jean à la piscine, à la piscine. La piscine, à la piscine. Le stade, Anne va au stade. Le cinéma, au cinéma. Le terrain de golf, au terrain de golf. So however you do it, just really teaching it through lots and lots of practice, and then you do the reproduction stage, and then you do the same contrasting here, feminine with things beginning with a vowel or an H, and then here this is contrasting the feminine with beginning with an H, and we've got some plural here, and finally you get to the one where you've got all of them together. So that will really test whether they know them or not. So those 3 stages of demonstration, comprehension and reproduction with those before you then get to the production stage. And this is the final testing, is production of the pattern via transfer. You're going to go into an unfamiliar situation, an unfamiliar context to see can they apply it. This is the most significant phase, since it tests pupils' understanding of a grammatical concept and their ability to transfer the rule involved to any other instance and produce productive speech. So in this particular sense, for example, you'd be looking for, have they got that concept of masculinity, which becomes operational in the rule that to the, with masculine, is u. So where does Michael go on a Saturday? Here are some examples where they haven't met them, only just the nouns are known, but not, they haven't seen it before in that sense. So here's a sort of thing that you could set is, where's he going on Saturday? Okay, we haven't used café in our example, we haven't used patinoire in our example, but would the student be able to apply it and say where they're going on the various days? So there we have it. We've gone through the demonstration, showing the language, not making them speak, but just hoping that they notice and they're aware. 2, the comprehension. They're not saying the new language, they're just saying by yes, no, or the names, whether or not they've understood. 3, reproduction. Find loads of different ways of making them say those phrases again and again and again. And 4thly, production. Can they apply it to a new situation? This may really seem laborious, but you will speed up as you go on. So, in conclusion, just talking about these 4 phases and using the speaking to introduce a structure. What about the speech act? Well, the pupils have been involved in a speech activity which had some social significance. So you were talking about where they went, you were relating to each other. There was some context, it was a bit limited, but there was some context, and there certainly was some content. And if you've been taught them properly, their speech will have shown comprehension of the message, they understood what it was, possibly some spontaneity and fluency of expression. Certainly you hope for some fluency of expression when you've practiced it so often. And then maybe even some paralinguistic features. Perhaps they did introduce gesture as well, or something in their voice which made it a little bit different. So what is the place of pattern practice in the teaching of oral speech? And this is pretty much lifted from the training that I had. It's only one type of oral speech activity in the classroom, and I'm going to be doing another session on different types of oral speech activity. So it's only one type. It is very artificial, it's restricted, it's teacher controlled, but it's unavoidable, it's essential, especially early on and in intermediate stages of foreign language teaching. And what's its merit? Well, it links phonological, grammatical and semantic skills in a systematic, sustained and contextualised sequence of mini speech acts. Pattern practice is an instance of using pointed questions. That's something which we do a lot, teacher-directed questions with predetermined answers, and that is essential in foreign language teaching because, unlike in all other subjects where they use their native tongue, foreign language pupils have a much more limited range of language with which to signal their own thoughts, so we have to help them. You can't really ask open-ended questions when you know that they really wouldn't know where to start. You have to have prepared them for that. And note the value of these questions, which can be pointed questions and be used for closed questions as well. Who did it? Where were they? When? Why? How? By train or by car or whatever? How many? The one which is less of an open question or a closed question is the what. But certainly they open up a considerable range of possibilities for analysing a situation orally. Really get them used to knowing what those questions mean, ever so important, and let them use them as well. And then my last slide on this to say that it's really pattern practice based on a meaningful context permits the teacher to move from the 4-phased pattern sequences to other speech forms. So having embedded those words, you could then go to look at dialogues, you could then go to look at group discussions where you're not necessarily going to always be going strictly through those phases. It's within their language, they can use it. And note that throughout, pupils are encouraged to supply answers, but also get them to ask questions, make requests, and give orders, do other things as well. Next, steps. I've given already a presentation focusing on how you use a mini speech act to present new language, whether it's vocabulary or grammar, and that's the listening and speaking phase of the lesson. I've put oral, oral, but in fact it's often the oral, the listening, which comes first, and then the speaking. And you need a similar sequential approach for the follow-up stage, thereby consolidating that spoken form, the oral form. So, first of all, reading to writing, you have the language read aloud, then you'll follow a sequence from reading, comprehension, through to writing, which is the reproduction, and then production in an unfamiliar situation. Also, you'll want to make the grammatical explanation clear, possibly making it so that the pupils articulate the rule and then you confirm or correct. This approach can't be used for every single word and structure over a 5-year course. As learners acquire more language and language learning skills, they will become more independent language learners. They will be able to identify patterns themselves from the models that they've heard through their listening or seen from their reading. They will be able to practice independently and they will be able to articulate the rules. So what I've been describing is very much what you would do at the early stages of language learning. As things go through, certainly with the 6th form, for example, they won't need to have anything presented in quite that way. They will be able to they'll internalise that process themselves. First of all then, what about that reading to writing sequence? Let's remind ourselves what the stages are. So you've got demonstration, comprehension, reproduction, production. Do you remember for the listening to speaking then, this was where you hear and notice that vocabulary. don't speak. Then you understand the vocabulary and grammar through answering closed questions, so still not saying the phrase. Then you have a stage where you have lots and lots of opportunities to repeat the vocabulary or use the grammar. And finally, you will use that in an independent context, an independent speech. Similarly, reading to writing, at a demonstration stage, you will present a reading material to the students, and you'll be expecting them to notice vocabulary and grammar, and then you check that they've understood what it means through questions, this time through structured questions, and there'll be another presentation on this to show just how you do that, the stages you use. Then there'll be exercises where, really getting ready for the writing in a productive sense, you will ask them not necessarily to copy out the vocabulary and grammar, but giving them exercises where the outcome is to copy things, so alternative questions, for example. And finally, you'll be expecting them to use that in independent writing. And the sorts of things that might happen then for the reading writing. The teacher gives the example, il va à la poste. Everybody does choral reading, so you're really working out, I mean, this particular one, what would it be? Instead of post, you're really stressing that's poste, poste, and they're not pronouncing the E on the end. So anticipate where they might make things wrong. Interesting there, isn't it, that sometimes cognates can cause problems because you see that, and as an English speaker, you'll think of oh, post, but we've got to train them out of that for this, poste. Then you would rub out the words as the teacher. So first of all, take that word out and say, on your mini whiteboards, write the one that's missing, and then take those two away. On the mini whiteboards, write the two that are missing, and so you could go on. And then they'd re-establish. Then there'd be some sort of copying exercise in a fun way. They've got to solve something. And the outcome will be that they'll write one of these. So you vas à la poste, you vas à la piscine. And then, yeah, actually learning for a test. You give them the substitution table, and it will be in your next lesson. I'll expect you to be able to produce this. Factors in planning early work for speaking and writing. Just remember these things. General rules of pronunciation associated with written are not always grasped. You need to build up a sight vocabulary. Actually, that's what you're saying to the students. You need to build up a sight vocabulary. They need to recognise it instantly. So teach meaning and pronunciation before making them read it. So deliberately be explicit. Give vocabulary in sentences using known words and sentence patterns. Be aware that there is likely to be interference, that when people start writing, that can interfere with spoken habit. And that's something a lot of teachers will tell you. The children don't hear us saying, for example, in French, il est grand. And yet, students who, when you've taught it in class and they can say il est grand, when they've written it down sometimes and then they reproduce it later, they are thinking about how it's spelt, and it really can interfere. So you really must constantly juxtapose the spoken and the written and point out the difficulties. Then the idea of integrating reading and writing with the speaking work, with the oral work. Try to get variety. Remember that for the children and for the teacher, there can be a fatigue factor. I've been talking about these sequences. It could get really, really tedious if you did that for every single thing that you did all in one lesson. So vary it. So the idea is, 15 to 20 minutes oral, then some reading aloud, and then some writing work. So these are just drawing out the points I've made here. This idea that native language really can interfere with the pronunciation of German and French. So next stage is grammar. And that's where, when you remember me talking about the different methods, sometimes they're put as opposite sides. Grammar and translation, communicative language teaching, it really is not like that. The idea is that you present things in a communicative, or my idea of what works is you can present it in a communicative way, but you definitely get the grammar sorted out as well. Explicitly check that. And the language that tends to be used is meta-language, talk about the language you need to talk about language. It really is important not to assume that pupils have learnt the rule through induction, through this idea of working it out. And that's what's called strong communicative language teaching, when you you leave it to them to learn the rule, and that gives communicative language teaching a very bad name. It is essential to do an explicit check that the structure's been understood by everyone before they leave the lesson. That's, if you like, the weak CLT. I don't really like the fact it's called weak, because I think this is good. So what could your strategy be? Well, you could say, in this lesson we've learned how to say to the, plus the places in the town, in pairs. Can you come up with a memorable rule in your language, your words, about when to use the following structures for to? When do you use it for ou, à la, and so on? Discuss it, and then you could issue a reference for the rule. So here's an example. This comes from the Coursebook Studio, where you're making it visually perhaps a little bit more memorable as to what it is. So remember, we've already presented it, so they're familiar with this, and to be able to say, well, that's one way that some people might remember it. But then here, let's try it out. You've got le cinéma, je vais. Right, what's going to go there? Mini whiteboards out, write it out, or call out, or competition, whatever you want to do. And it is, oh, next one, la patinoire, the skating room. Je vais, what's going to go there? Yes, à la patinoire. L'église, c'est je vais à l'église. Très bien. Les magasins, je vais au magasin. Très bien. And then you could give out this as being what they would look at. Notice that I've deliberately tried to make it really, really clear. Il, elle, Jean-Marie, va. So the idea is that you're going to take one bit from each column in the substitution table, à la with any of those, ou with any of those, and so on. And then have an explanation as well. The way to say to the or at the depends on the places, whether it's masculine, feminine, plural, or begins with a vowel. And I've tried to make the colours go with it. And if you can't use colours, you can't have a coloured sheet, then perhaps vary the font to make it clear how it's different. And then remind them about the pronunciation. If O followed by a vowel, H, remember to pronounce the X as a Z. Aux États-Unis, for example. Looking ahead, this is what I think an ideal substitution table is, to be honest, is where you've got the French, but then you've put, oh, that should have actually been in italics. The English is right next to it so that you can match it. So that's a really good reference sheet. It's not such a good testing sheet because it's all there for you, but having that sort of visual representation of it, I think, can really help. You definitely want to wean them off this. They can't have this in front of them all the time, but it's a really good way when you're presenting the language to have it in that format, and everybody can then access it. So, my resume of what I've been doing in this talk. Oral drills should precede any grammatical explanations or rules given to the people, So this is the idea. If you remember right back to the grammar translation method, where typically someone would in that way write up the rule and then the students had to deduce them how that would be applied to other things. Really start with the oral bit and then let them work out the grammar rule. But grammar can and should be introduced orally in speaking and then explained, which can be explained visually as well. Yes, it is artificial, but this is less artificial than just putting up the rule and having these random sentences which people have to work out. It's more meaningful and it allows practice of other skills. So you've got vocabulary and gesture, that sort of thing, which they'll use as well. And an acceptance, that's a new word, an acceptance that such artificial drills are inevitable for language teaching. That's the way it is. It is artificial, but we do ways of trying to make it a little bit more meaningful by giving a reason for contributing, either by the amount of praise we give them, the marks they get, or in a game format, points. This is a checklist of the things which I feel I've gone through in this talk, so that if you're planning to introduce a set of vocabulary or grammar point, this might help you as a reminder of all the things that I've gone through. And I've got a slide for each of those 9 points now. Firstly, have you defined the objective in terms of pupil behavioural outcome? Have you gone through a thought process which has led to clarity about what the pupil is expected to be able to know, understand, do by the end of the teaching episode? And you'll notice, again, this trips off the tongue, you get used to it, just as you have listening, speaking, reading, writing, grammar, vocabulary, phonics. So know, understand and can do. That's something which, particularly when the GCSE came in, the idea was we want to have exams where people are showing positively what they know, positively what they understand, positively what they can do, rather than making it difficult for them so that they can't show those things. And that's how it could be worded. By the end of the episode, pupils will be able to blah, blah, blah. And think about those 3 S's, thinking of the situation where it takes place, the context, the skills they're going to use, and the structure, the grammatical structures. So that's the first thing, really, really important, making that objective really clear. Then really it means that anyone coming into your lesson, if you've thought about that and you've put those words together, that's against what you've written, that's how they will judge you. So make sure that that's really accurate. Have you given an opportunity to use speaking as much as possible? So have you planned to allow pupils to interact with you through listening and speaking in order to learn the language, rather than giving them a series of written tasks to do? Have you selected an appropriate set or pattern of language? First of all, did you select a set which makes it so that something can be noticed? Have you identified any of the misconceptions? So that language pattern or paradigm should be memorable, both through hearing and seeing it as well, where you've got either the structure is going to be the constant and varying words, like we had in the example, or the words are constant and you have a varying structure. And have you put it in a language which allows for achievable, realistic question and answer work? So without suddenly introducing unknown words and structures. That's often a mistake, where people suddenly, when it comes to the question and answer, bring in words that they don't know. And I thoroughly recommend the third person. And then the stages, those 4 stages. Firstly, demonstrating the language. Have you demonstrated it in a context where they can notice a pattern, begin to understand it, make it authentic? And have you a plan to allow them to be exposed to the language repeatedly, again and again and again, before having to repeat or use it? The second part of the process is the comprehending. Have you planned to check that pupils understand it before using it? And give them that opportunity to hear and read it again and again. Ideally something which there's a reason why they have to say it. So closed questions, yes, no. Third part of the stage 3 is reproducing the language. Have you given them just loads and loads of opportunities to practice it in a familiar setting, first of all? That's really important. And have you heard them? And there the question type tends to be alternative questions. Is it this or is it that? And that leads to the target question, the open question. And then producing the language, the last stage, which just be aware that some people don't get there even in the next lesson. For some of them, that really might be a step too far. It might be something when you come to revisit this the next year, they'll get to that level. But, have you thought then, for those people who can do it, have you given them an opportunity to apply it to a new setting? So ideally in an information gap task. Right, another thing, pronunciation, sound and spelling. Have you ensured the opportunity to be explicit about that sound, spelling, correspondence? So don't give out something with it all written without deliberately going through it and saying it aloud. Remember here, I am talking about when you're deliberately, intentionally introducing a set of vocabulary or grammar. And finally, the grammar. If that is targeted, have you included the chance for pupils to express their understanding of a grammar point? Because the way they say it will be a way that you'll be able to work out if they really have understood it, have they internalized it, and have you been explicit about the grammar point? So don't leave it to chance. So again, I would say thank you very much to the people at Goldsmiths who helped me, particularly Mr. Banks, Mr. Swain, who used these as, you can see it's going back quite a way. This is not new. the bibliography there. And to finish off, I've told you about the sequence. I thought I'd just finish off by telling you how the lesson could begin, because I've said it would be good to set anything that you do in some sort of, as realistic or as relevant context as you can. So I'm about to go through the lesson. This is the beginning of the lesson now. I've been talking about the importance of having a sequence when you come to teach a grammar point or a set of vocabulary, but obviously when you're introducing the context, it's good to have a good introduction and to have good follow-up. So these few slides to show you how you might start off a lesson where you're going to be leading into a sequence. So here's my context that imagine I'm teaching year 7, but I will tell them when you're in 5e, in year 8, on va en Normandie, we're going to go to Normandy, which is the case. We take about 4 coach loads to Normandy. Alors, nous voici, nous sommes à Dorking, that's where we are. On va en gare jusqu'à Douvres. En gare, on va à Douvres. Go to Dover, puis on traverse la Manche. We go over the English Channel, la Manche. Et puis, on va en car jusqu'à la Normandie, en Normandie. Et puis là, on reste là, à ma Normandie, et on visite cette région. We visit this region. Voilà. Et un jour, on va à Cabourg. One day we go to Cabourg. By the way, I'll be saying this probably in French. Voilà, Cabourg. Et nous voilà. There we are. This is what we do. We have a picnic there before we walk down the street. On descend la rue pour aller jusqu'à la plage. We go to the beach. So it could be at this stage that I say, well, let's have a look at Cabourg and what sort of places. And I imagine that I will have already taught them in a previous lesson places in a town. So imagine that you have shown that video. It could well be that you'd anyway used it in a previous lesson to introduce those particular places in a town, or you could, having shown it, and I think it's nice to show the whole thing, then show it again, perhaps without the sound, and pause to be able to talk about all of the various places. So, oh, it's starting off again. I don't want to see it again. So that could be a way of doing it. And what I've done here is I've taken pictures, stills from the places in Cabourg, and you do all sorts of warm up to before you go into the structure. Let's just make sure we know these places. So for example, you would be saying, not writing this, il y a une plage, où est la plage? And then it could be that they've all got this is a piece of paper in front of them with all of the places, and they've got to point at it, or you've lettered it and they've got to say the letter. There are all sorts of games that you can do on that. Où est la plage? Ah, la voilà. Il y a un cinéma. Où est le cinéma? Where is the cinema? Ah, le voilà. So you're getting there. There is a. Where is the? There it is. And then something with a vowel. Il y a une église. Où est l'église? So there's a church. Where is the church? Ah, la voilà. Il y a des magasins. Où sont les magasins? Ah, les voilà. So do your normal games. If you've done this perhaps in the previous lesson, you might not have to spend very long on this. But if, say, it's been a week since you did it, you will need to do some revision so that it's really fresh in their mind, that idea, the concept of gender, the difference between a and the. So having played all your games, then you could perhaps introduce, here's the situation. So we're imagining that we're in Cabourg, and we're going to do a treasure hunt. There's a treasure near here. Are you ready to go and find it? You've got to go and find the various indices, clues. But first of all, let's just talk about where would these clues, where are they like to be? So, and then it could be that you're going to say find le cinéma, le stade, le terrain de golf. So again, it could be that they've got that in front of them, and they've got to point. There's got to be the first person to point at it or pick it up if it's a card. And there again, notice that I am using colour codes for masculine, feminine. That's what I've chosen for a vowel or an H, and there we are with the plural. And by the way, this really is, they look rather large, don't they, for a year 8, but they are. They're year 8, end of year 8. And there's my colleague Heather Hook, who leads this, and it's just a fantastic experience. It really is. They're about to be told what to do there. So you can be talking about that. Here's what I might have given them all as something where they have to either point at things or call out the number. I particularly use something called secret choice. And in this game, it's where I would divide the class into 2, and there'd be 1 to 16 on one side, 1 to 16 on the other. So I just count them out. So they've got, then I'll say, put at your hand number 1. So the 2 people who've been number 1 put at their hand. Put at your hand number 2. They put at their hand so they see who their adversary is. And then it could be that I will call something out, like, for example, voilà la gare. Attendez, wait, and they'll say numéro 5. And then people who are number 5 both put up their hands, and the first number 5 who puts up their hands gets to be able to tell me which number it is. And if they get it, they get something for their team. And then you go on to the next one. Voilà le terrain de golf. Be careful, wait. Alors numéro 16. And that will be the people who are number 16 put up their hand, and they would be, if the first person who puts up their hand who is number 16 would say 8. That might sound a bit garbled, but it's something which is really, really worth doing. It's so easy to play that game, and I find that they really are competitive, and you'll make it that it's the first side of the class who's up to 10, for example, who wins, and so on. So that's the to be continued. That's how I would set it, and then in a sense you can go back to the rest of the video now and see how I would then go on to introduce, here's so-and-so who goes to a particular place. If I've got time, I might do the whole lesson as a separate video, but for the moment I'm going to leave it there, because I think if you've managed to get this far, really, really well done.